Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. For those who are here, I think most people are probably fairly familiar with the Employment and Support Allowance. Between the introduction of the assessment in October 2008 and February 2012, 1.36 million new claimants were assessed, and of those, 794,000 were declared fit for work. Of those, 311,000 appealed that decision, and some 116,400 were successful in their appeal. And what that means is that nearly 1 in 10 of all ESA assessments have actually been overturned. And although the proportion of assessments overturned has started to fall, the overall number remains very high. And those figures don't include all the incapacity benefit claimants that are currently being migrated to ESA, a process that started last year and is due to be completed in 2014. And the cost of appeals is a considerable issue for government, with the cost this year projected to be rising to 70 million from 50 million. I've been considering a number of detailed aspects of the issue. In May last year, I secured a debate in Westminster Hall on the recommendations for new descriptors for mental, intellectual and cognitive conditions, which had been drawn up by a number of charities. In December last year, I secured another debate where I highlighted the fact that people are regularly being called back for reassessments just months after their previous claim had been granted. Today, however, I want to focus on the provision of audio recording equipment in assessments. I sent the Minister an advance copy of my speech because I think this is a very serious issue which deserves us trying to reach a constructive solution. And I'll spare him the need to spend time telling me that it was my government that started ESA. I know that. But it's the experience, it normally has been, it's the experience of the system that I think has shown many of us that it needs substantial reform. The assessments that have been carried out by Atos have been much criticised. Assertions have been made about some of the questions asked, about the attitude of assessors. For example, I met a constituent recently, and by no stretch of the imagination a disability activist, I have to say, who told me that in her assessment the assessor made a comment about her handbag and said, well, I couldn't afford that even on my salary. Now, my constituent tells me this was a present, but she felt this was irrelevant and carried with it the implication that she didn't need benefit. Now, assertions of this sort of thing are regularly denied by Atos and not accepted by DWP. We even have differences of opinion in the Work and Pensions Select Committee, with some members who feel that campaigning organisations exaggerate these sorts of claims. I believe that audio recording of assessments would actually allow those disputes to be settled once and for all. And they would also, and I think this is very important, provide important new evidence in the event of appeals. But they should also improve the quality of assessments, and that would reduce the overall number of appeals, getting things right first time. And assessors will be prompted to ensure that their work is of the highest possible standard. For example, taking more time, asking open as opposed to closed questions, and probing possible follow-up issues. Indeed.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she's making an excellent speech about the importance of quality in the work capability assessment. Could I bring to her attention the situation of my constituent, George Rolfe, who is currently on the 23rd day of his hunger strike about his treatment at the hands of Atos, and when he failed his work capability assessment, he felt he had no other choice but to take such drastic action to bring to the government's attention the failures of this system.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention and giving a very graphic example of the human issues that lie behind what might seem quite a dry subject in many respects. I was pleased when the Year 1 Harrington Review recommended that Atos should undertake a pilot to test the hypothesis that audio recording would make a difference.
Would you already give way?
Indeed.
This is a really vitally important issue in my constituency, because every week in my constituency, in my office, I have these issues to do with the Atos work capability schemes. People who go into the work capability tribunal test, they receive no points at all, or little points, and the question they ask is, how can they disregard my health? Would the introduction of the audio recordings enable my constituents and your constituents to have confidence in this system?
Shiela, Gilmore.
I think that is exactly the point that I'm trying to convey here, that we do want to improve the schemes and give people that confidence. And I was quite interested today to come across an article, in fact a headline, frontline headline in the Mail, which says, record your builder to make sure he sticks to his word. This was a recommendation by, in fact, the Honourable Member for Eastern Bartonshire in her capacity as a Minister in Biz, and basically suggesting that this would help to resolve disagreements in these situations. So the pilot that was agreed went ahead in the Newcastle Centre between March and May of 2011. An evaluation report was submitted to the DWP on the 4th of June 2011. In a Westminster Hall debate that we had on this subject on the 1st of February 2012, the previous Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Epsom and Ewell, set out the government's position. He said that due to lack of demand, audio recording would not be rolled out for all assessments. Specifically, he said, we decided not to implement universal recording because, based on the trial experience, people did not want it. I'm afraid this assertion is not justified. The Atos pilot concluded, and this was their quotation, 68% of customers agreed to the recording when contacted by telephone prior to the appointment. Due to some claimants not turning up for their assessment or deciding eventually they didn't want that, that dropped to 46% who completed and went through their assessment with recording. But that figure is still substantial. And this demand, I would argue, is reflected in one of the key conclusions from Atos themselves, where they concluded in this pilot, our recommendation would be that recording should become routine, as it is in a call centre or, for example, NHS Direct. Through a number of parliamentary questions that have been asked by various members and freedom of information requests, have yielded another metric to defend the government's position. This is that very few claimants in the pilot, we're told, requested a copy of the recording. We're told only 1%. But this really can't be regarded as an accurate reflection of demand for two reasons. Firstly, assessors in the pilot used handheld devices, and recordings had to be transferred to computers and burnt to CDs after assessment. So claimants couldn't pick up the recording on the day. They would have had to go to the added effort of making requests in writing. And in effect, this required claimants to both opt into the pilot and then opt out again to get their recording. And we don't know entirely what claimants thought that pilot was about. After all, quite often when you phone various sorts of helplines and so on, you get the recorded message that this is going to be recorded for staff training purposes. So it's quite possible that claimants in that pilot were not altogether clear what the purpose of this was. They were also told, however, that recordings would only be of use to them in the event of an appeal, and the report was completed days after the pilot was concluded. So most of those involved at that stage wouldn't yet have received a decision on their claim, yet alone come to a view as to whether they were going to appeal. So demand for copies might well have been higher after a longer period. So I would ask the Minister to accept that the number of claimants requesting a copy of the recording from that pilot is not an accurate reflection of demand. And what we should be looking to is the number of people acquiescing to their assessment being recorded. So turning to what's happened since that pilot in the 2 years since, I want to refer back to the statement given by the previous Minister on 1st February 2012. In addition to claiming that there hadn't been much demand for audio recording, he did, however, say, we will offer everyone who wants it the opportunity to have their session recorded. But in practice, it's very hard to have an assessment recorded. The option to request recordings is not mentioned in the official DWP communications to claimants. Now, I was reassured to see that, in fact, the DWP website was updated just last week on the 6th of June to say this, to say that DWP and Atos were going to amend written communications. I think what the words were, we are working to introduce more independent, widespread information for all claimants as soon as possible. But this is 2 years after that pilot and still working to have this included in communications. Doesn't seem a very complicated sentence to include in letters to claimants. And I think, again, as my colleague, the Right Honourable Member for East Ham said in a debate on the 4th of September, even when requests are made, they're not always met due to lack of equipment. A Freedom of Information response from 22nd May this year indicated that Atos now had some 50 audio recording machines. But this is inadequate given that over 11,000 assessments are undertaken across the country every week. And another FOI request from 23rd May suggests that this national rollout may even be a temporary measure which is going to end later this year. So, can the Minister confirm when DWP communications are going to be able to inform claimants that they can have their assessment recorded? How many audio recording devices does Atos now have access to? And can he confirm whether the recordings that are currently taking place are part of a wider rollout, which is intended to be permanent, or merely a further pilot? It was the report in 2010 from Professor Harrington which prompted the Newcastle pilot, and it's worth saying or looking at what Professor Harrington had to say on that issue since then. In his December 2012 report, which is the third and final report, he said, "The pilot of audio recording has also been subject to much debate. The review has seen little evidence from the DWP evaluation of the audio recording pilot that the universal audio recording assessments would improve their quality. Further monitoring and evaluation work needs to be completed before a decision can be made." Now, the Minister might want to interpret Harrington's reference to little evidence as suggesting that audio recordings make no difference. But I would argue that what he was actually getting at is the inadequacy of the pilot commissioned and accepted by DWP, and that's why he actually called for more examination of this issue. Because what the assessors did in this pilot was to take a small number of reports, review them in the light of the recordings, and conclude that they tallied with each other, that what the written report said and what the recording said were the same. And subsequently, the main arguments that seem to have come from the government have both highlighted and ignored various metrics of demand mentioned in the report to justify their policy. But neither of these approaches actually answers the key question: do audio recordings improve the quality of assessments? And instead, I would contend the key performance indicator should be the proportion of decisions that are subsequently overturned on appeal. And a more robust pilot would have involved taking larger samples of both recorded and unrecorded assessments and examining the proportion of successful appeals for both. If they were the same, then it would be fair to conclude that recordings make little difference. But if there were a smaller proportion of successful appeals from those that were recorded, then it would be equally fair to conclude that they were worthwhile. And I think we also have to be clear whether the current rollout is actually just another pilot, which is still to be evaluated. And if it is to be evaluated, then it would be useful to know what is going to be evaluated. And this has a relevance, in fact, beyond ESA, because DWP now says that it will make a decision about audio recording of personal independence payment assessments after the evaluation of the ESA experience. That's despite the fact that one of the companies tendering for that assessment, the PIP assessment, Capita, originally offered to audio record all its assessments. So asking the right questions about what evaluation is for is crucial.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Is it not important that not only the impact on quality is tested, but also the impact